Hey, so it's 10 years I've been eating a plant-based diet now, and shock horror, I'm still here, still not dead from the old protein deficiency as rumoured. And look, I feel great, and I appreciate that's immensely anecdotal, and I'm merely one single case study for this way of eating, but I do feel really good. But that's not to say there hasn't been challenges. And actually, there's things I observe in many of my fellow vegans and plant-based dieters, no matter, frankly, their experience level, that I think can really trip people up feeling great on this lifestyle. So today I want to cover my top 5 mistakes. Make sure you're taking care of these things so you can really thrive with this amazing way of eating. Now, mistake number 1 is interesting because it also can be a massive advantage to you. So let me explain, but it's the unintentional calorie drop. And you see, what often winds up happening is you switch lots of meat and dairy products, of course, to the whole plant foods. And it depends on the composition of the plant foods that you're substituting, of course. But what you'll find is in much of the literature and much of the information on transitioning to a plant-based diet, some of the substitutes, many of the substitutes that are advised for the old animal products to switch over, they actually tend to be lower in calories per pound/gram. And so what winds up happening in effect here, for example, is you might take a meat and dairy-based meal at 650 calories, switch that to a plant-based meal, veganize it to a plant-based meal of a similar volume, and suddenly now it's 500 calories and you've shaved 150 calories off. Now again, you might be looking at your waistline, looking sadly at the excess body fat and going, you know what, Rye, I've gained a little bit of weight lately. Hurrah, brilliant, that's fine, that's an advantage to me. But sometimes if you take the calorie drop too far and you're in far too aggressive a calorie deficit, the crash and burn comes anyway and you're compromising your energy levels, feeling tired, feeling fatigued. Ultimately, it's really important that yes, you don't overconsume calories, but you don't underconsume calories. Undereating has a litany of other problems too. And what actually winds up happening, I find, is with a lot of the ex-vegans that gave this way of eating a shot, and I don't want to diagnose everything that went wrong in all of those cases in one generalist sort of diagnosis solution. But what I do often notice, I must say, is, oh my goodness, yeah, when you break down your diet, you were literally eating like 1,300 calories a day as a 6'1" very active male. Of course the crash and burn was coming, mate. And what winds up happening is they put the blame at the door of plant-based eating versus, no, actually, you were just seriously under-eating. And that's a really important nuance to understand. That's a really important distinction to make. So it's about ensuring that maybe you want a very intentional, maybe your calorie drop is intentional, but it's about ensuring you don't siphon off too many calories from your diet as you transition over to this way of eating, because you're now eating so many fiber-rich, self-limiting, filling, satisfying whole foods, whole plant foods, and therefore the calories have very naturally dropped. Again, advantage, but also disadvantage if you take this too far. And the fix for this is rather straightforward, I find. It's also having a mix, a sensible mix there in your diet of the more calorie-rich whole foody options. And these would be things like nuts and seeds, of course, things like avocado being a little higher in fat and therefore higher in calories, tofu, tempeh, using those are technically processed foods, but still very clean in my book. Adding some of those things in to keep the calories from being dragged too low, I would suggest. Plant-based diet mistake number 2, as the sun does its best to ruin our fantastic video here and destroy my retinas at the same time. Mistake number 2, ignoring omega-3s. Now, frankly, omega-6s are quite easy to come by. There are other sources, but primarily the nuts and seeds. Omega-3 is a little more tricky, and also a distinction. I think something that a lot of folks don't understand is it's not necessarily about maximizing the omegas, especially with omega-3. It's not about having as much omega-3 as possible, rather having the right proportion of it versus the amount of omega-6 you're having. And that's maybe a whole video in itself, because that's where it does get a little bit complex, and I want to keep this kind of simplistic and actionable. So all I wish to say right now is, don't forget your omega-3 too, because it does require a little more thinking. The fixes, of course, include the likes of chia, flax, hemp seed, what else is on my list here? Walnuts, of course, and Brussels sprouts, which always surprises people. I don't know if you're a fan. I am, controversially, a fan of the old Brussels. But I also recommend, as your insurance policy, taking an omega-3 EPA supplement from algae oil, just to be sure that you're getting the right amount. And of course, by extension, there are other nutrients we must talk about too. Also making sure you're getting enough vitamin B12, supplementing vitamin D, I would suggest also, that's mandatory, I consider. And there are other arguments about things like zinc maybe iron, especially if you're menstruating. Those are other considerations, calcium too perhaps, but really frankly it depends on the composition of your diet, I would say, and your last blood work checks. That should always inform you, hey, okay, maybe I need to up my game with this. But one thing that is worth saying as an aside is the plant-based diet is not an inherently deficient diet, and I do not think the meta-analysis back this up on nutritional deficiencies. That is often the trope, that is often the stigma. I don't disagree. I don't agree actually in the least with that supposition. Number 3 is my eyesight has kindly been returned to me. Be careful falling into the sort of vegan junk food obsession. It's very easy to do now because lots of our favourite junk foods have now been veganized. Food manufacturers certainly have capitalized on this. And, you know, the obvious trope here being that vegan isn't automatically healthy, which if you're a longer term viewer, you've heard me repeat many times. It's probably a rather tedious broken record from me on that, but living off these substitute items and just veganizing all your favorite junk food desserts, you know, things that, you know, some of the mock meats that are really crammed with saturated fat, really high in calories. Of course, quite obvious to say these things are still not going to be good for you. And some argument you can make that they're better. I'm not talking about the ethical aspect, of course, that's already assumed, but better in terms from a sort of a health perspective and things that correlate with, associated with risk factors for increasing risk factors of major chronic disease. Yes, maybe you can make that argument that the vegan junk food equivalents tend to be lower in saturated fat, for the most part, unless they use coconut oil, than, you know, the meat and dairy equivalents. Yes, so maybe you can make the stepping stone argument here, but ultimately the solution that I've offered many times on this channel is sort of this going in with this idea of like 90 to 95% whole plant foods. And it's not to say, by the way, that everything processed incidentally is really terrible either, because I think you can still find, you know, healthy bread products, excuse me, the plant-based yogurts, I'm so Americanized now with my speech, cereals, you know, bran flakes, etc., that are still processed, you know, some condiments, soy sauce, supplements, for goodness sake, we've just spoken about, they're technically processed, aren't they? Are they automatically unhealthy? No, I think that's a bit of a binary way of looking at things. Like, just because it's not a whole food, it's therefore bad, clearly isn't quite that straightforward, I would suggest. But generally speaking, this kind of philosophy of 90 to 95% whole foods, that's what I want my plates, my bowls to look like, and that's really going to ensure that, yeah, I'm eliminating the nasties as best I can, or at least significantly reducing the nasties in my diet. So beans, our other legumes, so lentils, peas, etc., are whole grains like oats, brown rice, quinoa, and so on. Fruits, of course, veggies, and nuts and seeds, these being the 5 or 6 primary plant food groups. Base most of your meals around these more whole foodsy options. You really are setting yourself up for success. Plant-based diet mistake number 4 is the fear of eating out. Truthfully, I was torn about including this one in the list because I think a lot of us do eat out far too much. And when we do eat out, it's assumed that we're going to make a really bad choice as well. And so simply through abstinence, through the commitment to a challenge to let's not eat out for the next month or two, I think the advantage that can pose from a health perspective is astronomical. So that's why I was kind of on the fence, like, do I include this? But ultimately there's a question about sustainability. Are you going to avoid eating out forever? Likely not. Now, that doesn't mean you need to do it loads right now just because you might in the future. Because maybe the best thing for you right now, after eating out multiple times a week for 20 years, is to say, no meals out for the next month. And that would be fantastic for you. So you can start building some new routines, get yourself in the kitchen a little bit more, learn what you like and what you don't like about different plant-based ingredients. And this is gonna supersonic speed run is the term I'm looking for. Your success early on here, I would suggest, by doing lots of home-cooked meals. That's the direction we need to ultimately go in anyway. But I think there is a question about sort of real-world practicality and sustainability of this stuff. And if you always keep meals out as this big taboo, as, well, they're always going to be bad, they're always going to be, you know, I have drinks as well, and I have an appetizer, and I have my main, and it's not a salad, it's the burger option, then I'm having dessert too. And then the next day I kind of wake up feeling a bit naff about myself, and it's easy to grab a bit of chocolate then and make some poor choices the next day because, you know, there's a crack in the dam now, so I've messed this up, I've failed now, it hasn't gone so well. So What am I even bothering for? People do have this very sort of doomsdaying negative self-talk. And so to best manage that, I think, you know, meals out, they're like this elephant in the room that you need to confront through doing, not through avoidance. And rather, it's not about avoiding meals out, but simply learning how to make better choices. And you can absolutely do this on a plant-based diet. It is, of course, worth saying, no, it's probably not going to be as healthy as what you'd make at home, but we're assuming you're not doing this all the time anyway. These really will be one-offs. If you think about eating 21 main meals a week, if only 1 to 2 of those are meals out and you still make quite good choices, I personally don't have such a high standard that I think that's wrong or that's really mischievous, just 1 or 2 in 21 meals. That's like 5% of your diet. I think that's a very reasonable ratio for real world life, okay, for most of us. So I kind of like that. I'm kind of okay with that, so long as they are relatively, on balance, good choices. I'm not perfect, so there's no sort of moral high ground preaching here, like every meal out must be a salad. That's not necessarily what I'm saying, but if we can get you in the direction of eating meals out that are, again, a bit more whole foods focused, great. Now, what I was going to say earlier before shock horror riffing as I always do on various tangents, some cuisines obviously lend themselves better to plant-based eating than others. The first thing that springs to mind, you've heard me talk about this a lot before, is Japanese food. You can do vegetable sushi and sides of edamame, maybe tofu-based sides as well. Some of this stuff can be greasy and oily, but directionally this is much better than going to a standard, certainly if you're in the US or Canada, a North American themed restaurant. Europe is a little bit better, I find, in terms of portion sizes, in terms of things not being quite so bloody deep fried, to be honest. But still, we have problems here too. You know, those conventional Western restaurants, I would say, can be quite challenging at times. And that's where you are going to look for your soup, salads, your sides, the 3 S's. And you might have to sometimes pull some weird meals together just from the couple of sides you have. And it's not ideal, but at least you're not making some 1,500 calorie burger choice and just going absolutely hog wild. Some of the Southeast Asian cuisines can be quite good alongside Japanese food too. Just be careful with lots of those coconut milk-based Thai curries in particular, I would suggest, but some of the clear broth style dishes, so some of the Thai soups, some Vietnamese pho can be really awesome. They can be brilliant. Lots of whole plant foods in there, maybe a little bit of oil in the broth, but not too bad, calorically relatively well in check. And again, lots of nutrients still in the meal itself, which is what we're looking for. Calories in check, lots of nutrients in the meal itself. Fantastic. For a meal out, anyway, you'd make it better at home, cleaner at home, fantastic. Salad bars and poke bowl type places, acai type stores, these are good options as well. Maybe you go out and you get yourself a nice, really superfood smoothie. There are options when you eat out, in other words. Mexican food, tricky, because they put chips on the table and there's lots of dairy and creams, but there's stuff to work with there. Just the standard rice, beans, veggie combo can work really nicely. With Mexican food, it's kind of about being pretty crystal clear with your boundaries. Well, I will have this, but I'm not having this. Hey, ask the server, can you omit this? It's about being a little more clear. There's a little bit more finessing that you have to do with the meals that turn up with Mexican food, I find. But there's stuff to work with there. Then there's stuff that there is very little hope. And it's Italian food, frankly, which I love. But there is, in many cases, very little hope. Because you're going to have a pretty, not that it's terrible, but a pretty bland, maybe pasta dish with maybe just some sort of basic tomato marinara without the meat and cheese, obviously. And so that's pretty uninspiring. But again, at least you're not making some really, it's not a carbonara, it's not some big gluttonous choice. And always with Italian food, you're looking at maybe getting some veggies on the side. So stuff that you can actually work with there that isn't too Puritan, it isn't too perfectionistic, no, I concede, but better than what can wind up happening, maybe that is happening right now when you do eat out as well. So yes, eating out is possible, but you just need to learn how to do it correctly and actually just get in the habit of that. Going out to eat and that it isn't some blowout or some indulgence, and seeing that it doesn't. Maybe there's a bit of sodium in your system, so your weighing the next day is higher, but that it doesn't derail things. If you're in a weight loss phase right now, which is not what this video is about like my others, but if you are trying to lose weight right now, gaining confidence from the fact that it doesn't totally derail you is a really important thing. And lastly, but most certainly not least, plant-based diet mistake number 5, Carbitarian syndrome. I love that Carbitarian syndrome, we're calling it. I think the clue's in the name. What I see with a lot of new vegans and plant-based dieters, until they correct this as they advance a little more, is their carbohydrate intake goes through the roof as they transition to this way of eating, rather naturally and of course rather unintentionally, because loads of whole plant foods tend to be very high in carbohydrates. To be crystal clear on this, I do not think that a high carbohydrate diet is inherently a bad thing. I do not join the anti-carb bandwagon that is very prevalent in the mainstream health and weight loss world, certainly in the ketogenic community, the ketogenic diet community, where carbs are terrible, carbs are the cause of all bad things happening in modernity, in the modern age. I don't prescribe to this whatsoever. I still follow a high carbohydrate diet according to nutrition research standards anyway, with 55 to 60, sometimes more % of my calories coming from carbohydrates. I still eat a high carb diet, so this isn't a don't eat too many carbs thing. That's actually, if you see my other videos, you'll very likely know that's actually the opposite of my stance on this. But at the same time, I always come at this from the frame of, I want a high carb diet. I don't want such a high carbohydrate diet that it displaces some really important inclusion of the other two macronutrients, being of course fat and protein, as you likely know, and the other nutrients that foods rich in fat and protein can offer that some of the high carb foods simply cannot. And so I like this idea of having a very balanced and diverse diet nutritionally. And so for me, I still want my healthy fat sources, the nuts, the seeds, the avocado, the tahini therefore in my hummus, tahini in salad dressings and whatnot that I make up. Some of the fats in tofu, tempeh that I mentioned earlier as well. Also then the protein sources, of course, those being tofu, tempeh, beans, legumes, etc., etc. Some TVP, sometimes I use a plant protein powder, to be transparent about that as well. Not that I feel that's necessary, but convenient for me. And so, yeah, I even think the protein thing is utterly out of control. Protein is now the sacred macronutrient, which started in the gym bro community, 20 years ago, and has now permeated to mainstream health advice as well. And so just basically I'm being very diplomatic, going too far in any one direction with your intake of one particular macronutrient and perhaps at the cost of it ostracizing another macronutrient, I think is nuts to me. I think it's bizarre. I think they're all essential. I don't think they're critical, because I do think you could technically live quite well in some cases if you plan your diet really well without so much of one particular macronutrient. But what I think is optimal is to have all three, because they all, in my mind, play different roles in the body. There is some overlap. So like protein is a good example of this, because it can mimic carbohydrate. Eventually you might convert unused protein to glycogen. That can happen. There is a pathway to where that happens. And so they can kind of mimic each other to some degree, but there's some nutrients that you can't compensate for. We talked about the omega-3s early on. If you're not having those fat sources, if you're not supplementing from algae oil, where are those omegas coming from? Case in point. So I like this idea of having a balanced, nourishing plant-based diet that provides me with all the nutrients that I need. So I just don't want to go too high carb, which is very easy to do with plant-based eating, that I displace some of those other things. Not because high carb is bad, again, hear me on the distinction, but rather of what you might miss out on by doing so. And that's it. These are my top 5 plant-based nutrition mistakes I wanted to cover today. When you get these things right and you do the best planning you can on a plant-based diet, it really can set you up for success. That's my experience, 10 years eating this way, but there are still traps and mistakes that I've certainly made along the way and that I observe other vegans and plant-based dieters making. So hopefully, if you struggled with any of the things I've talked about in this video, the information I've shared today sets you straight. If you want to set yourself up for success with the long term and find a realistic and simple way to eat a sustainable plant-based diet that you can follow for the rest of your life, and you have 15 or more pounds to lose, so you're also coming at this from a weight loss motive as well, you can check out my Insider Doc, where I break down exactly how I've coached 600 clients through this process since 2019. You'll learn a lot more about working with me one-on-one there, if that's your intention, if that's your wish. And so I'll put a link down in the description box below so you can check out the Insider Doc for more info there. Even if now isn't the right time to work with me, I'm sure you'll grab some pointers and some directions on what to look at from a plant-based diet perspective, what to fix, what to work on, what could be improved, and really the recipes for making it sustainable for the long term, because that's what it's all about, right? We don't want another flash in the pan little diet thing, little sprint. We really want this to stick for life. See you in the next video.